He left her in a coma and planned a future with someone else, never expecting she'd wake up. On the day of his second wedding, Elise opened her eyes. No speeches, no revenge, just a silent walk into the church he once promised her. As guests held their breath, she stood at the back alive, unseen no more. What she said next shattered everything he built in her absence. If you've ever wondered what it means to be forgotten, and then choose not to disappear, this story will stay with you, because sometimes survival isn't loud. It just walks back in and refuses to be erased. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. Rain slicked the city streets in sheets of silver, making reflections shimmer like oil paintings beneath the orange streetlights. The wind whipped stray leaves against car windows, and wipers moved in rhythmic desperation. At the corner of Pine and Mercer, a crosswalk signal blinked red, casting its glow onto the puddle-covered pavement. Elise stood at the curb, her coat pulled tightly around her frame, hair damp and clinging to her cheek, one hand gripping a folded umbrella, the other pressing her phone against her ear. "Wait up," she said with a breathless laugh, stepping off the curb without looking again. "I'm right across the street. Don't order without me." The voice on the other end said something playful, teasing. Something only lovers say when dinner plans run late and hunger hasn't dulled affection. Elise smiled. Her foot hit a shallow puddle, the splash barely registering over the approaching roar of tires, a screech, rubber against asphalt, a sudden blare of a horn far too close. The car didn't stop in time. There was no scream, just the blunt, terrible sound of a body meeting metal, then pavement. Elise's umbrella flew into the air, spinning once before landing near the curb, ribs bent like broken fingers. Her phone skidded into the gutter, screen cracked and still, faintly glowing. The impact threw her several feet before she crumpled onto the crosswalk's edge. Her coat had fanned out behind her, soaked instantly by the rain. One shoe had come off. The silence that followed was eerie, broken only by the soft thud of raindrops hitting the warm hood of the car and the panicked gasps of a driver who had already started dialing emergency services with trembling hands. Within minutes, red and blue lights reflected off the wet streets. Paramedics worked in efficient murmurs, checking pulse, stabilizing her spine, lifting her onto a stretcher. Someone shouted that she was breathing but unresponsive. A witness nearby repeated that she had stepped into the crosswalk while the light was still red, but no one seemed sure. The driver kept repeating, "I didn't see her eye, didn't see her eye, swear I didn't see her." Inside the ambulance, Elise's heart rate showed on a dim monitor, a small green rhythm holding steady. Her eyes never opened. Her face, pale and streaked with rain, stayed still. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic and echoing urgency. They cut her coat away, checked for fractures, scanned her skull. The CT confirmed swelling. Nurses moved quickly to prepare for surgery. A doctor scribbled notes. Someone called next of kin. Daniel's phone rang at 10:47 p.m. He didn't answer. On the first ring, he was on the couch, scrolling through takeout menus. The second ring made him pause. The third made him sit up. By the time he arrived at the hospital, Elise had been moved into intensive care. A nurse led him to a waiting room where time had no edges, just cold coffee and plastic chairs that squeaked when you shifted. "She's stable," the doctor told him, "but unresponsive. She's in a coma. We don't know yet how long. The next 48 hours are critical." Daniel stood there holding Elise's phone. It had been returned to him in a plastic evidence bag, cracked and water damaged. Her last call had been to him. The call had never ended. The rain didn't stop that night. It rapped softly against the ICU windows while machines beeped and breathed for her. Elise's body remained still beneath starched hospital sheets, her hair combed gently by a nurse who hummed old songs as if they might travel somewhere inside. No one knew yet that the crash would not only shatter Elise's body, but also everything that had once tethered her life to someone else's. The bell above the door chimed softly as Elise pushed it open with the back of her hand, the scent of aged paper and cinnamon tea drifting toward her like a welcome. The bookstore was the kind she always gravitated toward: narrow aisles, wooden shelves that groaned under the weight of forgotten novels, and mismatched lamps that cast golden pools of light across checkered floors. Daniel followed just behind her, his hand lingering at the small of her back, even as he mock-sighed and said, "Every time we say it's a 10-minute stop, this time, it really is," she said, already drifting toward the poetry section. Her scarf trailed behind her, and Daniel watched her weave between shelves like she belonged in that space more than anywhere else. He didn't rush her, never did. Against the philosophy section, arms crossed, watching her fingers trace the spines of books. Sometimes she would stop, tilt her head, pull one down, and flip through pages until she found a sentence that made her eyes still. That was her test for a good book, she once told him, voice low as if the books were listening. He walked over and took the hardcover from her hands. He read the line aloud, "There are people who become a kind of weather. You carry them in every forecast. Are you trying to make me cry in public?" He asked. "You don't cry," she teased. Nudging his side, he held the book in his hands for a moment longer before setting it on top of the growing pile. "No, but I remember things like that." They drifted through the store together, pausing to comment on odd covers. Elise loved how safe it all felt, how unhurried Daniel was when she talked about her favorite authors or ranted about cover redesigns that made classics look like airport thrillers in one aisle. Near the back of the store, a small handwritten sign caught her eye. "Take a book, leave a note." Taped to the wall above a shelf of secondhand titles was a corkboard filled with index cards, and handed it to her without needing to ask. "Write one to who?" she asked. He shrugged. "To me, or to the book, or to some stranger who might read it next." Elise bit the end of the pen cap, then began to write. "To the person who loves quietly but shows up loud when it matters. Don't stop doing that. Some people carry storms. You carry anchors." Daniel read it over her shoulder when she pinned it to the board. "You're the least subtle anchor." "I know." He took her hand as they headed to the register, their fingers laced with the kind of ease that comes after years of not needing to pretend. The woman at the counter, older and wearing thick reading glasses, smiled at them over their stack of books. "You two married?" Elise laughed. "Not yet." The woman nodded toward Daniel. "Don't let her go." Daniel didn't look away. "I won't," he said simply. Later that night, back at Elise's apartment, they sat on the floor with mugs of tea and the pile of books between them. Rain tapped against the windows. Elise leaned against his shoulder, flipping through the poetry book she'd chosen. "You know," Daniel said, his voice quiet but certain, "if anything ever happened." "Anything. I wouldn't go anywhere." She looked up at him. He shook his head. I mean it. No matter what happens, Elise, I'll be there. Always." She closed the book and tucked her head beneath his chin. He kissed the top of her hair. Neither of them knew that the promise would soon be tested by silence so complete, only memory could answer back. The walls in ICU room 6 didn't seem to change. Pale blue, sterile, always too bright or too dim. The blinds were drawn halfway, letting in slices of afternoon light that painted the floor in patterns no one ever looked at for long. The machines hummed their soft mechanical rhythm, a steady beep. Marking Elise's heartbeat, another clicking faintly as it regulated her for flow. The air smelled of antiseptic and something else harder to name. Stillness had taken up residence in the corners of the room, a kind of quiet that didn't invite rest so much as remind you what wasn't happening. Elise lay there unmoving. Her dark hair had been gently brushed by the nurses, but it didn't fall the way it used to. It clung to the sides of her face, tucked behind her ear, like someone had done it absently. Her face was unchanged, serene in a way that made it almost easy to pretend she was sleeping. Except sleep doesn't stretch on for days or weeks or months. The first time Daniel came, his footsteps echoed down the tiled hallway like he didn't belong there. He carried a paper bag with one of her favorite books inside, along with a small sketch she once made of the two of them in a park stick figures under a tree, a heart-shaped kite overhead. He didn't look at the nurses. He didn't ask questions. He just walked in, sat in the plastic chair by her bed, and stared. He didn't speak right away, just looked at her. His fingers rubbed the corner of the paper bag until it crinkled. Her left hand rested outside the sheet, small and still. He didn't hold it. Not then. Eventually, he cleared his throat. "They said, you might hear people," he said. His voice was too loud in the quiet room, so I thought I'd talk. He talked about the bookstore, about the note still pinned on the corkboard, about how he'd tried reading the poetry book she picked out, but most of it didn't make sense to him. He left the bag on the small table beside her, adjusted the corner of her blanket, and sat a little longer in silence. That visit lasted 34 minutes. The second visit came 3 days later. He brought flowers. He forgot to bring a vase, so he left them in the paper sleeve on the counter by the sink. He sat again, this time reading her a passage from a book, something about trains and memory. He didn't finish the chapter. His voice broke near the end, and he mumbled something about traffic before leaving. A week passed before he came back. The nurses began to notice the pattern. His visits grew shorter, further apart. The flowers wilted, still unvased. The sketch curled at the corners. He stopped bringing things, stopped reading. One day he came in, stood by her bed, and simply said, "They're not sure if you'll wake up." His shoulders slumped as he said it. He wasn't crying, but his hands kept tightening into fists, then releasing. He looked at her face like he was trying to memorize it, like he wasn't sure how many more times he'd come back. He left before the hour ended. The chair beside the bed remained pulled out, slightly angled toward the window, as if waiting for someone else to sit there. After that, he came once every 2 weeks. Then, only on Sundays, then not at all. The nurses never said anything, but they noticed. Maya, the evening shift nurse, would sit with Elise for a few minutes after checking her vitals. She talked about the weather, about hospital gossip, about books she thought Elise would like. She played piano music from her phone, just loud enough for Elise to hear if she was listening at all. Time in ICU room 6 wasn't measured in days, but in rhythms, heartbeats, machines, shifts. Weeks passed, then months. Daniel didn't return. The flowers were thrown away. The book disappeared. But the sketch remained, taped now to the cabinet above the sink. And Elise remained, too, breathing, unmoving, waiting in the stillness, while the world she had once belonged to continued without her. 3 months had passed since the accident, and ICU room 6 had become a place people passed with polite indifference. The hallway remained the same, soft-soled shoes gliding over polished tile, clipped voices at nurse stations, the occasional whir of a mobile monitor being wheeled past. Behind the glass door, Elise lay as she always did, motionless, pale, eyes closed against the world that hadn't waited for her. Nurse Maya knew the rhythm of this room better than most. She had the evening shift that week, the one no one liked. The quiet hours after visitors had gone, when the fluorescent lights buzzed just enough to make the silence feel heavier. Maya didn't mind it. She preferred the stillness. It made her notice things others missed. She entered Elise's room just after 9 p.m., her chart lay balanced on the edge of the counter, unchanged. Temperature stable, heart rate steady, blood pressure low but consistent, the same vitals she had recorded the night before and the one before that. Maya adjusted the 4 tubing with practiced hands, then moved to smooth the folds in Elise's blanket. The fabric always bunched near her left shoulder, no matter how carefully it was. "Tucked, you're not making it easy," Maya murmured with a faint smile, always a little stubborn. It wasn't protocol to talk to patients who hadn't responded in months, but Maya talked anyway. Some nights, she read from the books left behind. Elise's mother once said she loved Debussy Satie, piano pieces with slow rises and gentle falls. Maya didn't know if it mattered, but it felt like someone should stay connected, even if Elise couldn't. She was adjusting the monitor wires when it happened. A flicker, subtle, quick. Elise's fingers moved, not a full motion, not a spasm, not the involuntary twitch of a sedated body. It was more like a curler feint, almost shy flexing of her right index finger as if testing the air. Maya froze, her eyes locked on the hand. For a moment, nothing. The finger twitched once, more, curling slightly toward her palm before relaxing. "Wait," Maya stepped back, voice caught in her throat. She moved closer, watching Elise's hand with focused stillness. "Elise? Elise? Can you hear me?" She waited. A long moment passed. No movement. Maya checked her watch, marked the time, and wrote down what she saw. It wasn't procedure to note something so uncertain without confirmation, but she did anyway. Under observations, she wrote in small, firm script, patient exhibited voluntary finger movement at 9:17 p.m. Observed twice, possible response to external stimuli. She stayed another hour, watching. She spoke Elise's name gently, asked her to move again, to squeeze her hand, to give any sign. Nothing more came. The next morning, during handoff, Maya brought it up. I saw a finger movement, twice right index, voluntary. It looked deliberate. The day nurse-grin, older, clinical, and always cautious, nodded, but didn't write it. Down, we see muscle twitching sometimes. Reflexes could be spinal, not cortical. Happens more than you'd think. I know the difference, Maya said, but her voice was quieter now. Karen offered a tired smile. Let's just keep monitoring. You know how it goes. Later that day, Maya checked the record. Ordered, no tests scheduled. Just another evening folded into the ongoing quiet of ICU Room 6. She returned that night with a paperback book and a renewed sense of focus. She placed her fingers gently over Elise's hand and said quietly, "You moved." "I know you did," but Elise didn't move again. Not that night, not for weeks. The finger twitch faded from memory like a gust of wind that never rattled the blinds. One kept, except Maya. She never forgot it. Not because it changed anything immediately, but because it told her something no machine ever could. That somewhere deep inside the stillness, Elise was still trying to find her way back. Daniel stood in the apartment's living room, staring at the wall of frames above the bookshelf. The rain tapped lightly against the window pane behind him, and the room smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. He hadn't touched those pictures. In months, they'd become part of the background, lingering like ghosts in plain sight. The largest frame in the center held a photo from 2 summers ago. Elise sitting on a bench in Prospect Park, squinting into the sun. Her hair was windblown, and she was mid-laugh, holding a melting ice cream cone with a napkin clutched in her other hand. Daniel had taken it without her knowing. She hated it at first, called it unflattering, but he loved it, said it was the most honest picture he'd ever seen of her. They'd framed it together. Now he couldn't look at it. His hands hovered near the edges of the frame, before he finally reached up and took it down. The glass was cold in his grip. He laid it face down on the couch, careful not to make a sound, as if the photo could hear him. One by one, the others came down. Elise in front of the old lighthouse on their trip to Maine. Elise leaning out of their second-story window, waving down at him from above. Elise asleep on the couch with a book across her chest. Sunlight caught in the arch of her bare foot. He didn't know why he was doing it that night, only that he'd stood in front of those photos long enough for something inside him to give way. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the fact that her toothbrush still sat in the bathroom cup and her coat still hung on the rack by the door, even though she hadn't worn it in over 3 months. "I'm not erasing her," he said out loud, though no one was there. To hear it, "I'm just making space to breathe." He didn't say the word coping, but it hovered there, unspoken. It sounded like a clean term, like something a therapist might say. Daniel hadn't gone to a therapist. He'd thought about it, even bookmarked a few numbers, but he never made the call. Instead, he took down photographs at 10 o'clock at night and placed them in a storage bin from the hall closet. He didn't wrap them, just layered them face down with the care of someone who didn't want to break anything, but also couldn't bear to look at them anymore. When he closed the lid, the sound of plastic snapping into place felt louder than it should have. He left the bin under the bed. He told himself Elise wouldn't want him to live in a shrine, that she'd probably laugh at how carefully he was, handling everything, how he tiptoed around the edges of his grief like it might lash out if disturbed. But that was the trouble with imagining what Elise would say he didn't actually know anymore. Grief distorted memory. And as days became weeks and weeks became months, the sharp edges of her voice dulled in his mind. He used to be able to summon it exactly. Now it came in fragments. A laugh that ended too soon. A sentence without the right rhythm. He hadn't told her parents what he'd done. When they called to check in, always polite, always gentle, he didn't mention the photos. He asked if the hospital had called, if there was any change. There never was. They still called her stable. He didn't know what that meant anymore. Stable just meant still alive, still not there. Elise's mother had once offered to come pack up her things, but Daniel told her it wasn't necessary. "I'm okay," he'd said. "I've got it under control." But he didn't. He slept on the couch now, even though the bed remained untouched. He didn't cook. The fridge held nothing but takeout containers and a few bottles of water. He went to work, answered emails, nodded at the right moments. Everyone stopped asking after the first month, as he turned off the lights and prepared. To go to sleep, he glanced once more at the bare wall where the photos had been. The paint was slightly lighter beneath where each frame had hung. A quiet outline, a memory of a memory. He told himself it was just temporary, that one day, maybe, he'd put them back, but he never did. The first leaves had already started to fall when the nurses swapped out Elise's light summer blanket for something warmer. Outside the ICU windows, the maple trees along the hospital's west drive burned gold and rust red against the gray sky, their color deepening day by day in slow, quiet defiance of the cold. Inside room 6, time moved differently. No wind, no season, just the soft whir of machines and the steady rhythm of Elise's breath. Artificially supported but unwavering, pinned to it, unchanged since August, no one had bothered replacing it. Most of the staff had stopped pretending to count time in days or weeks. Around Elise, it was measured in vitals and shift changes. In the precise routine of sponge baths, 4 checks, repositioning every 2 hours. The kind of care that wasn't about progress anymore, just maintenance. The visitors, logged near the nurse's station, showed the same pattern. Elise's mother signed in every Thursday, staying from noon to 3, always bringing hand cream, and reading aloud for a little while before sitting quietly beside her daughter's bed. Her father came on Sundays. He didn't read, just sat with both hands on his knees, watching the monitor's slow pulse without blinking. But Daniel's name had not appeared for weeks. At first, the nurses asked, "Has he been in lately?" Maya would shake her head gently, not offering more. Some new nurse once joked, maybe he moved on, but no one laughed. The room was too still for that kind of speculation. Even hope had a quieter tone there. Daniel had stopped answering calls from Elise's parents sometime in late September. Not abruptly, just with increasing delay, texts turning to silence, the space between replies widening until there were none. Elise's mother never confronted him about it, not directly, but her eyes were tired in a different way when she left room 6 now. Elise didn't know the season had changed. She didn't know the world had cooled, that Daniel had disappeared from her bedside, or that the bookstore they once loved had gone out of business the week before. Her body remained unchanged. Her hair was longer now, gently braided every few days by Nurse Maya, who refused to let it tangle. Her arms bore no bruises, her nails were trimmed and neat. On the outside, nothing was wrong. Inside, no one knew. Sometimes, in the early hours of morning, Maya would dim the lights and sit near Elise's bedside with her own book. Not to read aloud, just to be there, to remind the room that someone was still waiting. "I don't think he's coming back," she whispered once, not to Elise, but to the silence. Outside, the world moved on. Couples took photos in piles of leaves. Halloween decorations appeared in shop windows. Fireplaces flickered back to life. But Elise's world remained suspended. No holiday music, no shifting daylight hours, just the same blanket, the same machines. The same window where the trees were visible but untouchable. One evening, as the wind howled across the parking lot and lifted brittle leaves into spirals, a nurse passing the door paused. Room 6 was so quiet she thought the monitor had flatlined, but no, it still blinked, still beeped, just soft, almost hushed, like the machines had learned to whisper. On her nightstand sat a plastic frame with a photo of Elise and Daniel. It had faded from exposure to sun and time, the colors now more memory than image. No one had removed it, not even her parents. It remained where Daniel had once placed it months ago, back when he still believed she might open her eyes. Now the storm was over. The flood of visits, the hope that clung to every new scan, the frantic checking of messages, all of it had ebbed away, leaving something quieter, not peace. Not exactly despair either, just stillness. Autumn settled around IC. Room 6 like a blanket too heavy to lift, and Elise remained, breathing softly, waiting in a silence no one knew how to break. The office cafeteria was always too bright. Fluorescent lights hummed above the scattered plastic tables, and the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder during the lunch hour, marking time no one wanted to acknowledge. Daniel sat near the window, picking apart a chicken sandwich he hadn't really wanted, pretending to check emails on his phone. His reflection in the glass looked tired, There were circles under his eyes he hadn't noticed before, and the suit jacket he wore felt heavier than usual, like it belonged to someone else. Across from him, Brielle stirred a paper cup of soup, the plastic spoon tapping the sides with rhythmic patience. She hadn't said much yet. She rarely did at the beginning of their lunches. It was one of the things he liked about her, that she didn't force conversation to fill the silence. She just let it breathe. She had started joining him at lunch. A few weeks earlier, it wasn't planned. The first time, she'd simply asked, "Mind if I sit?" After both had reached for the last bottle of sparkling water in the break room fridge, he had nodded. She'd taken a seat, and they ate in a kind of companionable stillness that neither of them seemed to question. The next day, she was there again, and the day after that, Brielle worked in legal, 3 floors above him. Sharp mind, quiet voice, he knew little about her life outside of work, just that she liked crossword puzzles and had a dry sense of humor that crept up on you when you least expected it. "You always get the same sandwich," she said finally, not looking up. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Do I? Turkey, cheese, no tomato." "You leave the crusts." He gave a small laugh and set the sandwich down. "That obvious? Only to someone who's paying attention," she said, her eyes meeting his for a second longer than necessary. Then she looked away and took another sip of soup. He didn't mention Elise, not then, not in any of the lunches that followed. It wasn't that he was hiding her exactly, it was just easier not to explain. Easier not to say her name and watch. People tilt their heads in that gentle, pitying way. He had grown tired of that expression, and anyway, Brielle never asked. Maybe she sensed something in the way he always kept his phone screen face down, or in the way his eyes sometimes drifted mid-conversation to some far-off place he never described. Once asked if he had plans for the weekend, he hesitated. Then said, "Not really." She didn't press, just nodded like that made sense. They began walking to a nearby cafe instead of staying in the cafeteria. "A change of scenery," Daniel said. Brielle agreed. She had a way of walking slowly, but with purpose, as though she didn't need to rush to know where she was going. Sometimes she'd stop at a corner to admire a bookstore display or mention an art show she'd seen. Once, she handed him a flyer and said, "You might like this. It's quiet, thoughtful, like your kind of thing." Daniel didn't know what his kind of thing was anymore, but he took the flyer. He liked that Brielle didn't ask too many personal questions. He liked the way she listened. And he liked that, when she laughed, it was soft and rare, like it belonged to someone who saved her joy for people who deserved it. He began looking forward to lunch. He began wearing shirts that didn't wrinkle as easily. He started checking, his reflection again, running a hand through his hair in the elevator mirror. At night, he told himself he was healing, moving forward, that people grieve in different ways, and no one stays broken forever. He didn't tell Brielle about the hospital, about Elise's parents, about the photo under the bed, or the dreams that woke him up some nights in a cold sweat, not from fear, but from the memory of Elise laughing beside him in the bookstore. Wind in her hair. He never told her Elise's name at all. Daniel bought the ring on a Tuesday. He hadn't meant to do it that day. There was no moment of epiphany, no grand romantic urge. He had passed a small jewelry shop on his way back from a client meeting, the kind with velvet-lined displays and gold-lettered signs that looked untouched by time. Something in the quiet glow of the window made him pause. The weather had just started to turn the city, caught between autumn and early winter. Cold wind creeping beneath coat collars, sky low and gray. He stepped inside. The saleswoman spoke in a hushed tone, as if she were working in a library or a church. She asked about preferences, stone shapes, metals. Daniel nodded mechanically. He didn't know what Brielle liked. Not exactly. But he knew she didn't care for things that sparkled too loudly. She wore minimal jewelry, quiet and precise. Like everything else about her, they settled on a modest solitaire, set in brushed platinum, clean lines. Simple elegance. He didn't compare it to the first ring. He didn't think about the one in the apartment drawer. Tucked beneath Elise's folded scarves in the back corner of the wardrobe he hadn't fully unpacked, it was still there, untouched since the day he placed it gently in its box after the accident. He had never opened that drawer again, not even once. When he held the new ring in his hand, Daniel felt the weight of it. It didn't feel wrong. It didn't feel right either. It just was. He proposed on a Friday they had dinner. At a quiet bistro, Brielle liked French food, small tables, low candlelight. the kind of place where people spoke softly and lingered over desert. She wore a dark green dress and her hair up in a way that exposed the line of her neck. Daniel had reserved a table near the back. He didn't make a speech, just reached across the table after the second glass of wine and said her name, Betrayal. She looked up, blinking slowly, her lips parting as if she already knew. He placed the small velvet box on the table between them. Her fingers trembled, just slightly, as she reached for it. When she opened it, she didn't gasp or cry. She just stared for a long moment before lifting her eyes to meet his. "Are you sure?" she asked. He nodded. "I am." She nodded too, then slid the ring onto her finger with a small, steady breath. It fit perfectly. They kissed. The waiter brought champagne. There was a quiet chorus of clapping from nearby tables. No one asked questions. No one knew the name Elise. No one knew there had been another ring once, waiting in the dark for a hand that had never worn it. Back at the apartment that night, while Betrayal was in the shower, Daniel sat on the edge of the bed. The bedroom was clean, minimalist. Betrayal's influence showed in every detail: the framed black and white prints, the neatly stacked books, the corner where she kept a small tray of perfumes and silver earrings. He walked to the wardrobe, opened it slowly, pulled out the drawer. He had sealed off in his mind. Inside, nothing had changed. The box was still there, small, navy blue, with the initials of a downtown jeweler embossed in silver on the lid. He opened it. Elise's ring was different, warmer, rose gold. A vintage setting with a faint filigree pattern along the band. He had chosen it because she once said she liked things that looked like they'd been found in an attic. "I want it." "Something with a history," she'd said, laughing, holding up an old postcard at a flea market. "Something that's already survived something." He closed the box without touching the ring. He didn't throw it away, just placed it back where it had always been and slid the drawer closed. In the other room, water ran from the shower. Steam. Curled beneath the bathroom door, Daniel sat for a while, eyes closed, breathing quietly. The ring on Betrayal's hand gleamed under the bedroom light. The other ring waited in silence. Maya had been working night shifts at St. Augustine Medical for nearly 8 years, long enough to know the difference between honest oversight and something else. The ICU was a place of pattern-scheduled vitals, chart updates, medication, intervals. Deviations usually meant one of two things: either someone was overwhelmed or someone was paying less attention than they should. In room 6, where Elise had been sleeping through seasons, Maya began to notice a different kind of shift. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was wrong. The first sign was small. Elise's hydration levels had dropped more than expected during the last 48-hour cycle. Nothing severe, just enough to make Maya pause when reading the charts. According to the records, 4 fluids had been replenished on schedule, but the bag had still been mostly full at the end of the shift. Maya had seen it with her own eyes. She'd written it off at first. Maybe the line had kinked, maybe the flow rate had been miscalculated. Simple, correctable. But it didn't stop there. The next week, she found a note in Elise's log that claimed a neurologist had completed a routine. Reflex check on Tuesday at 2:15 p.m. Maya was off that day, but she checked the security camera. Footage later that night, unofficial habits she'd learned during her first year, one that had quietly helped her catch things others missed. At 2:15 p.m., no one had entered Elise's room. Not a neurologist, not even a nurse. She brought it up during shift handoff the next morning, asking if there had been a scheduling error. The charge nurse glanced at the log, then shrugged. Maybe. They didn't badge in. Some of the consultants don't scan in on single visits. Maya nodded, but the explanation didn't sit well. Over the next few nights, she watched more carefully. Elise's sheets weren't being changed as regularly. Her call button had been unplugged, despite the fact that patients in comas were supposed to remain fully monitored and accessible. The music player she occasionally left running with calming piano tracks had been turned off more than once, even though it had been set to low volume and continuous play. One night, Maya returned from a brief dinner break to find the blinds. In Elise's room drawn tightly, the room darker than it should have been. The log said nothing. No one claimed to have adjusted anything. It was a slow accumulation of wrongness, like dust collecting in corners that shouldn't exist. One evening, as she gently brushed Elise's hair and checked her pupil response with a pen light, Maya whispered, "What's happening, huh?" You're still here? And someone's trying to act like you're not. She checked the medication logs again. Everything was technically within acceptable range. No missing doses, no red flags. But the tone of the entries had changed. Fewer notes, less detail. The handwriting rotated more frequently, often initials without names. Staff that Maya didn't recognize had signed off on critical care tasks during shifts she'd sworn were covered by regulars. She brought it up again in the staff lounge, casually at first. Hey, have we had new float nurses rotating into room 6? A nurse from another wing replied without looking up. ICU's being repurposed. They're trying to cut down the hours for long-stay patients. That word -long-stay-stuck. Was now a number, a bed space, a quiet room that didn't demand attention. Maya began making extra notes in her own journal. She copied Elise's vitals by hand, time-stamped everything she observed. She started checking that the 4 dripped properly, that the machines recorded what they said they recorded. It wasn't fear driving her, it was instinct. Something had shifted, not just in the room, but in how the system seemed to be closing in around it. She filed a quiet request for a full chart audit, citing inconsistencies in logging. 2 days later, her supervisor called her into the office and asked her to take a week of scheduled personal leave she hadn't used. "You've been working too hard," he said gently. "You deserve rest." Maya nodded, but she didn't believe the words as she packed her bag that night. She stood once more at Elise's bedside and whispered, "I'm coming back. I don't know who wants you forgotten, but they'll have to go through me to make it happen." And Elise, still and silent, gave no answer. But Maya could have sworn the monitor blipped just slightly off rhythm, as if something buried deep inside had stirred in response. The waiting room on the 5th floor was quiet enough to hear the wall clock tick. Elise's parents sat side by side on the vinyl love seat, a stack of paperwork between them, untouched. Her mother's hands were folded tightly in her lap, the way they had been since she first learned to pray as a girl. Her father kept tapping his foot, trying not to let it show, the kind of tension that settles in bones after months of uncertainty. They hadn't been expecting a call that morning, but a nurse had stopped by Elise's room with a clipped message. "Dr. Kessler would like to speak with you both privately." They waited now for the meaning of that word. Dr. Kessler arrived 5 minutes late, apologizing with a tired smile and a coffee stain on the cuff of his coat. He wasn't Elise's primary physician. They'd seen his name on documents but never met him in person. He was from the neurology department, a specialist in disorders of consciousness. He took a seat across from them and set a tablet on the small round table between them. "I want to share some information with you," he began carefully. "We've been running periodic assessments on Elise's neurological status. Nothing invasive, just tracking eye movement, reflexive response, and cortical activity." Her father sat up straighter. "You mean brain scans?" "Yes," Kessler nodded, "and more than that. We've started using a scale called the CR-SR Coma, Recovery Scale Revised. It's a tool designed to help us detect signs of minimal consciousness." Her mother leaned forward, eyes wide and already shining. "Has something changed?" The doctor hesitated just a beat too long. "We've detected patterns that suggest Elise may not be entirely unresponsive," he said. "In certain tests, her brainwaves showed activity that aligned with auditory cues. There were small, inconsistent, but meaningful changes when familiar voices were played, specifically yours." Her mother covered her mouth with her hand. Kessler continued, "This doesn't mean she's conscious in the way you and I are, but it does mean she may be processing sounds. She may be aware on some level of her surroundings. That changes the conversation." They asked questions. So many. Could she feel pain? Could she hear them right now? Would she wake up? Was this recovery? The doctor never used that word. He spoke instead of possibility, of potential, of things that couldn't be promised but also couldn't be ruled out. When the meeting ended, Elise's mother walked directly to her daughter's room without speaking. She sat beside her bed, took Elise's hand, and whispered over and over, "I'm here, we're still here." Her father stepped out into the hallway to make the first call. He dialed Daniel's number twice. No answer. On the third attempt, it rang long before going to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He texted instead. "We need to talk. Elise may be hearing us. This changes everything." No reply. That evening, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone's glowing screen. He had read the message hours ago, read it again, but his thumb hovered over the keyboard without typing. He told himself there would be another update, another time. He told himself that hope was cruel, and false hope even worse. He hadn't seen her in months. The idea of showing up Nevev, stepping into that room again, and hearing a doctor speak in cautious maybes it, made his stomach twist. Instead, he turned his phone face down on the nightstand and rolled onto his side. At the hospital, Elise's mother stayed late. She played the recording of Elise's favorite poem, the one Daniel had once read to her in the bookstore. The words floated through the room in a slow, measured voice. Elise didn't stir, didn't open her eyes, but the heart monitor shifted. Slightly, a flutter in rhythm too subtle to chart. Dr. Kessler passed by in the hallway, glancing in through the glass. He didn't interrupt. He just watched for a moment, lips pressed in thought, and continued on his rounds. Behind him, Elise lay still except for her fingers, which curled once, faintly, against her mother's palm. The wedding invitations arrived in glossy cream envelopes, sealed with a wax insignia that felt excessive even before anyone opened them. The lettering was gold embossed, the kind of font you had to squint to read, but it was elegant, intentional, the kind of paper that didn't bend easily, that cost extra to print. Brielle had chosen the design after spending an entire Saturday comparing sample books at a boutique downtown. Daniel had nodded at each option, letting her lead the way he had with most of the planning. The ceremony would take place at St. Margaret's Chapel, an ivy-covered stone church, tucked between tall office buildings in the old quarter of the city. It was well known for its stained glass windows and worn mahogany pews, the kind that creaked under the weight of time and memory. Brielle liked the acoustics. Daniel remembered it for something else. Elise had once said she wanted to get married. They're not in a casual way, not in passing, she had said it with certainty. Tracing her fingers along the old stone during a walk through the neighborhood one winter afternoon. They'd paused outside the chapel as snow collected in slow flurries. She had looked at it the way other people looked at houses they wanted to grow old in. "This place feels like a memory I forgot to make," she'd said. "Like I've already walked down that aisle in another life." Daniel hadn't responded. Right away, he remembered nodding, squeezing her gloved hand, and smiling because she was smiling. At the time, it had felt like the sort of thing she always said, poetic, slightly dramatic, wrapped in sentiment. But it stuck. When Brielle suggested the venue, he didn't say anything. He didn't mention the snow, or Elise's voice, or the fact that he had once stood on those same church steps and imagined a different life entirely. He simply agreed. The deposit was paid. The date was set. The city hadn't changed. That made everything harder. The same streets, the same skyline. Elise's hospital just 15 minutes away from where Daniel and Brielle would exchange vows. He hadn't told Brielle that either. She knew vaguely about the accident. Knew there had once been someone else. But not the details, not the proximity. Not that Elise's mother might be walking the same sidewalks on the same weekend. Son planned to say, "I do" to another woman. When the invitations were mailed, one mistakenly arrived at Elise's parents' home. It wasn't addressed to them directly, just a leftover entry from a shared address book Elise had once helped compile. The calligraphy on the envelope made her mother pause before opening it. She didn't recognize the name on the return label right away, but when she slid the card out and saw the names printed in gold, Daniel Whitaker and Brielle Monroe, her fingers went still. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of the month. The ceremony would begin at 4 o'clock. A reception would follow at the conservatory. Elise's mother stared at the card for a long time. She didn't call Daniel. She didn't tell her husband. She just placed the card in a drawer near the sink and folded her hands tightly in her lap at the hospital. Elise's room remained unchanged. The same soft blanket, the same quiet hum of machines, the faintest scent of lavender from the lotion her mother applied every evening. She sat beside her daughter that night, brushing a strand of hair away from her forehead, and whispered something she hadn't said in weeks. "He's getting married," she said softly. "Next month, same church you loved." Elise didn't move, but her breathing hitched just once. A stuttered pause before resuming its normal rhythm. Not anything you could prove. But she reached for her daughter's hand and held it tightly, her voice steady despite the ache growing in her chest. "You don't have to wake up for him," she whispered, "but you don't have to stay gone either." The cranes started appearing in late November, quietly at first, one or two at a time, folded from bright squares of origami paper in soft pastels and tucked carefully into the corner of Elise's hospital room. Nurse Maya noticed the first one perched on the windowsill, wings angled upward like it was about to take flight. A few days later, there were 3, then 6. They were never left with explanation. No card. No name, eventually. Maya saw who brought them. She entered the room near the end of her shift and found a girl, maybe 8 or 9, sitting cross-legged on the vinyl chair near Elise's bed. Her sneakers barely touched the floor. A sheet of folded paper was open in her lap, her fingers creasing it with practiced care. A nurse had let her in quietly under supervision, and the girl had settled there like it was the most normal thing in the world. "You must be Lily," Maya said gently. The girl nodded, not looking up. "I'm her niece," she said, folding the paper with a kind of focused patience Maya rarely saw in children. "She taught me how. She did MM a long time ago, before the accident." Lily lifted the nearly finished crane from her lap and pinched its beak delicately before placing it beside the others in the corner. "Why the cranes?" Maya asked, crouching a little. "She said they were good luck," Lily whispered. "That if you made 1,000, you could get a wish. I don't think I can make that many, but I thought maybe they could help." She didn't cry when she said it. Her voice didn't shake. But the room seemed quieter for a moment, as if even the machines were listening. "She'd like them," Maya said softly. "They make the room feel less lonely." Lily stayed for another 20 minutes, folding in silence while Elise's monitor pulsed gently in the background. When her mother came to pick her up, she left 3 more cranes and a small pink envelope, taped discreetly to the underside of the bedside tray. Inside was a drawing of Elise with a speech bubble that simply said, "Hi, I miss you." The cranes became a kind of ritual. Every week, Lily returned with a handful, some made of patterned paper, others from old book pages or grocery receipts. She placed them in corners, on ledges, lined them up like a quiet audience around her. And Maya started counting them during her shifts, 37 by the first week of December, 50 by Christmas. Then came the morning when one was different. It was just after sunrise. The hallway was still dim, and Maya was finishing her rounds. She entered room 6 with a quiet familiarity, carrying the vitals cart and humming softly under her breath. That's when she saw it. One of the cranes, green with silver spexels, wasn't folded anymore. It lay open and flat on the floor near the foot of Elise's bed, like it had been torn apart mid-flight. Maya bent to pick it up. A faint tear ran through the centerfold, not clean, but uneven, like something had pulled at the paper from the inside. She turned it over in her hands. The edges were slightly damp, not soaked, just touched, like fingertips had pressed there. She glanced at Elise's hand, still relaxed, but her fingers were slightly splayed, not curled gently the way they usually rested. The sheet was rumpled near her hip, just subtly, like it had been moved and then smoothed again. Maya checked the security log. No one had entered the room during the night, no visitors, no unusual activity. Yet the crane lay unfolded in her palm, the tear visible like a line dividing then and now. She placed the paper on the table and sat quietly for a few minutes. Watching Elise's face, there was no movement, no blinking. But Maya saw a slight tightening near her jaw, the tiniest flicker. "You're trying, aren't you?" she whispered. "You're not just hearing us now. You're answering." No one would believe it, not yet. It was too small to prove. But Maya knew what she saw, and in the corner of the room, the paper cranes waited, their wings still open. It was just past 1 a.m. when Maya made the decision. The hallway outside, Elise's room, was quiet, only the low hum of overhead lights and the soft swish of rubber soles against linoleum. The shift had been routine until then. 2 new intakes, 1 discharge, no emergencies. But Maya had felt the tension in her shoulders all night, like something weighted unspoken beneath the surface. She entered room 6 with a small tablet in hand and paused beside Elise's bed. The monitor beeped steadily. The 4-line dripped in rhythm. Everything looked unchanged. But Maya had stopped trusting only what could be seen. She sat in the visitor chair near the window and tapped the screen. Opening a playlist labeled simply Elise Favorites, it had been started months ago. Maya had added to it slowly after speaking with Elise's mother and niece. Soft piano pieces, acoustic covers of old pop songs, a few classical movements, but near the top was a track Elise herself had once mentioned to Lilia. Recording of Debussy's Clair de Lune played on a slightly detuned upright piano. Maya pressed play. The music filled the room gently, not loud, just enough to blur the edges of the machine beeps. Technically, sound therapy was limited to 20-minute sessions at approved intervals. Hospital policy dictated it as a measured intervention. But tonight, Maya didn't stop the music. She didn't start a timer. She simply let it run. Back in the chair, arms folded, and watched. Elise's expression remained still. No sudden twitch, no obvious movement. But 5 minutes into the track, the heart monitor changed. Not drastically, just a subtle elevation 3 beats per minute higher. Consistent. Sustained, Maya stood and stepped closer, eyes on the screen. It wasn't random. The rise matched the transition in the song, the part where the melody arched upward in a slow, aching swell. A moment Elise might have recognized, even if her mind was still underwater. Maya whispered, "You hear it, don't you?" The monitor didn't answer, but the rhythm held. 10 minutes in, the pulse shifted again. A sharper increase this time, 6 beats higher than baseline. The nurse checked the other vitals. No sign of fever, no pain indicators, respiration steady. The only variable was the music. Still, she hesitated. If someone walked in, saw the session extended without a written order, it could be flagged. But Maya didn't move. She sat back down, tablet still in hand, thumb hovering near the pause icon. The track ended after 15 minutes. Maya waited. The heart rate declined slowly, returning to baseline over the next 3 minutes. It didn't plummet. It didn't spike again. But it eased back in the same measured curve the song had taken to rise. Maya made a note on her own pad. Not the hospital chart, her personal one, the one she had started keeping weeks ago after noticing discrepancies. She wrote the time, the title of the piece, the heart rate changes at exact intervals. Then she underlined 2 words, pattern she didn't tell the charge nurse. Instead, she added 2 more songs to the playlist from the recommendations Lily had left in her drawings. One of them was a lullaby Elise used to hum while brushing her niece's hair. She queued it up and let it play next dot as it began. Maya took Elise's hand and held it lightly, just enough to notice if it tensed or twitched. The skin was warm, the fingers slack. But after 30 seconds, Maya felt the smallest shift of muscle contracting faintly beneath her thumb. Not a full movement, but not nothing. When the night supervisor passed by later, Maya was standing at the foot of the bed, humming softly along with the music. The tablet screen had dimmed, the room was calm. The machines pulsed steadily in the background. No one asked. About the playlist? No one checked the timestamps, but Maya knew. So did the monitor. And somewhere beneath the stillness, she believed Elise knew, too. Not just sound, not just noise, but memory, and maybe, just maybe, a beginning. It was a morning like any other, at least from the hallway. The hospital ran on cycle shift changes, medication rounds, quiet hours. Nurses moved from room to room with routine precision. Machines beeped in their predictable language. Outside, the sky was heavy with the kind of gray that never quite becomes rain. Room 6 remained silent, but inside that silence, something changed. It was Maya's first round of the day. She entered with the usual rhythm: check vitals, scan charts, assess position. Elise had shown no major changes in the past few days, just the same subtle fluctuations Maya had started to treat as signals, a pattern in the heart rate here, a twitch of the eyelid there, enough to make her feel like something was shifting beneath the surface. Still, she never expected what she saw next. Elise's eyes were open, not fluttering. Half-lid motions that sometimes happened in comatose states, her eyes were open fully, steadily, blinking against the light above her bed. Maya froze, then slowly moved to the side of the bed, crouching to her level. "Elise," she said quietly, afraid to startle whatever had woken. There was no verbal response. There was a flicker. Not recognition, exactly, but awareness. Presence. Maya hit the nurse call button and then took Elise's hand. "You're back," she whispered, barely trusting the words. "You're really back." Within minutes, the room filled. Monitors rolled in. Orders were shouted in low tones. Light response, breathing analysis. Elise tracked the light with her eyes. She blinked twice when asked, Her lips didn't move, and her throat remained quiet, but she was awake. No one used that word out loud. Not yet. The official term was return of conscious awareness. The doctors cautioned against interpreting too much too quickly, but Maya knew. She had watched for weeks. She had waited. This was not a glitch. This was not noise. Elise was here. Her mother arrived within the hour, eyes already glassy. She rushed to the bedside, clutching her daughter's hand and whispering her name again and again. Elise blinked once. Then again, a rhythm began to form. Later that afternoon, as the chaos calmed, stepped in during evening rounds and saw Elise's gaze fixed on it. She followed her line of sight and spoke gently. That's tomorrow, Saturday, the 29th. Elise didn't look away. Her eyes remained locked on the circle. Maya sat beside her, speaking slowly. You've been asleep a long time, she said. A lot has changed. Elise's brows knit slightly. For the first time, Elise's lips parted slightly. No sound, but her breathing changed. A deeper inhale, a pause, then a slow exhale. Maya stayed with her until visiting hours ended. That night, Elise's mother brought a photo, an old one, Elise and Daniel in a bookstore, laughing over some bent paperback. She placed it on the bedside table, facing outward. Eyes tracked it immediately. She was remembering, not fully, enough to know who Daniel had been. Enough to know that tomorrow circled on a whiteboard was the day he would marry someone. Else, just blocks from where she lay in bed. Newly awake, still unheard, but awake, and that was enough for now. The lights were dimmed low in room 6, filtered through the pale blue of morning. Elise lay still against the hospital bed, her eyes now open more regularly, following movement when it passed her peripheral vision. The once frequent beeping of alarms had softened into a quiet rhythm, the machines adjusting to her stabilized vitals. Every small change had been logged, every blink and breath documented with cautious hope. She hadn't spoken yet. The doctors said it could take days or weeks. Her vocal cords were likely weakened, her throat dry from months of silence. But her eyes told stories. They shifted, focused, followed. She was aware that much was now beyond question. Her mother sat by the bed, as she had nearly every morning, holding Elise's hand gently while reading aloud. Today, it was a short letter Lily had written. Dear Aunt Elise, she began, voice soft but deliberate. You woke up. I knew you would. The paper cranes worked. I made more. I'll bring them soon. I miss you. Her fingers trembled slightly. At the last line, PSI told Daniel, I thought you'd want him to know. There was a pause. Elise's eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, but her chest rose sharply. Her mother noticed. She reached to smooth the blanket. That's when it happened. Elise's right hand, once resting limply by her side, clutched the bedsheet. It was not a reflex. It was slow, deliberate. Her fingers curled tightly into the fabric, pulling it toward her as if bracing herself. Her mother whispered, shifting to look at her face. Did you hear that? Elise didn't blink, but the hand didn't release. You heard me say his name, her mother said again, voice quieter. Daniel. Another inhale, shallow, and then the hand tightened again. She tried to speak. Her mouth moved slightly, a faint shape forming at the corners of her lips. No sound came, just the smallest, broken breath of effort. Her throat was not ready. The muscles hadn't caught up to her mind. But the will was there, and her mother saw it all in her eyes. A wave of feeling too large to name. Maya arrived moments later and checked the sheet where Elise's fingers remained clenched. The nurse met her gaze and nodded. You're trying to say something, Maya said gently, kneeling beside her. It's his name, isn't it? Elise blinked once. A slow, confirming motion? Okay, Maya whispered. We won't push you. Just keep holding on. We're here. She made a note in her private log patient attempts communication. In response to familiar name, Daniel, clutched sheet. No vocalization yet, but clear response pattern present. She added a timestamp, 9:42 a.m. Later that day, Elise's mother stepped into the hallway to speak with the specialist. Maya stayed behind. Alone in the quiet room, she stepped near Elise's bed again. They'll want to tell him, she said softly. About you waking up. Elise's eyes shifted. But I don't know if they'll find him, Maya continued. I don't know if he wants to be found. That was when Elise moved again. Her hand let go of the sheet. Then, with visible effort, she lifted it not far, not more than a few inches off the bed. But it rose, trembling, shaking from strain. Her fingers moved to her chest and hovered there, just above her heart. Maya watched, then Elise tapped once. Maya leaned in. "You want me to tell him?" A pause, then another faint tap. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try." When her mother returned, Maya didn't mention the taps. Not yet. She just stood for a moment longer beside the bed, watching Elise's hand fall gently back onto the blanket. The muscles trembled from effort, but the eyes, they stayed clear, steady, open. She couldn't say the name yet, but she didn't have to. Her body was starting to speak for her. The morning sun filtered through sheer curtains in Elise's hospital room, painting long, pale lines across the floor. Her eyes were open, tracking the shift of shadow on the ceiling. Her mother sat quietly beside her, brushing a strand of hair. Back, trying to keep her voice calm, she hadn't told Elise what had come in the mail just hours before. Not yet. The envelope had been waiting in the mailbox when they returned from the hospital coffee kiosk. Heavy paper, the kind meant for formal occasions, cream-colored with gold-embossed lettering. There was no return address, just Daniel's full name, printed with careful spacing across the front. At first, Elise's father had thought it was a legal update, a delayed insurance matter. But as he slid the card from its thick envelope, the truth fell into place, all too easily. The wedding was today, same city, same church, Elise had once pointed at and said, "Someday." The announcement wasn't sent directly to them. It had likely gone out to a larger list weeks before, and their address had been swept into it, accidentally, an outdated entry from a shared database. Maybe, but it didn't feel accidental, not to them. The card was beautiful, with its elegant, cursive font and a pressed image of St. Margaret's Chapel on the cover. The message inside was short and formal. Daniel Whitaker and Brielle Monroe. Request the honor of your presence at their wedding ceremony on Saturday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Elise's mother folded the card shut before Elise could see it. She tucked it deep in her purse, beneath tissues and receipts, and returned to the chair beside her daughter's bed, pretending nothing had changed, but her silence was heavier than usual. Elise, even without speaking, seemed to sense it across. Town Daniel stood before a hotel mirror, adjusting his tie. The collar pinched slightly at the neck, and his fingers moved without focus. His reflection looked unfamiliar to him, older somehow, even though only a few years had passed since the accident. He barely glanced at the note Brielle had left on the nightstand. "Don't forget your vows in your inside pocket." Deep breath. We're almost there. The morning had moved quickly. Haircuts, steam-pressed suits, groomsmen laughter echoing from the next room, but for Daniel, everything felt faintly out of sync, like watching a movie with the audio half a second behind. He couldn't say why. He hadn't thought about Elise in weeks. Not actively. He had filed that part of his life away in a box labeled "too painful" and convinced himself that letting go was the only way forward. Brielle never asked many questions, and he never offered much. When Elise's mother had stopped calling, he had assumed it was a sign of closure, of quiet acceptance. He never asked if Elise's condition had changed. Brielle's dress was ivory, not white. She had insisted on that. Something softer, more modern. She wore her hair in loose waves and pinned a small flower at the base of her neck. As she stood before the mirror in her own room, a bridesmaid adjusted her train and said something cheerful about the perfect day. But across town, Elise's father stood at the hospital window, holding the invitation in both hands. His jaw was tight, unreadable. Behind him, Elise's mother whispered something to their daughter, who lay with her head tilted slightly toward them. "He's getting married today," she finally said aloud. "You should know. He didn't send this to us on purpose. I don't think, but we got it." There was no reaction. Elise blinked slowly, her fingers barely twitching against the bedsheet. Still, her mother felt a shift in the room. Not anger, not shock, something colder, quiet, recognition. Beneath the hospital window, somewhere, distant church bells began to sound their early warning 1 hour until the ceremony. And though Elise couldn't sit up, couldn't speak, and had not been invited, she was awake. Awake on the day he made promises to someone else. Awake enough to understand what had been taken, and what had never been returned. The air was heavy with late afternoon warmth as Maya stepped into the parking lot, keys clenched in her hand, ID badge tucked under her jacket. Her break was scheduled for 1 hour. She rarely left the hospital grounds, but today she drove the car, moved through quiet streets, past flower shops with closed doors and dry lawns shaded by tall oaks. Maya didn't tell anyone where she was going. She didn't even tell herself exactly why. The GPS was unnecessary. She knew where the church was. Everyone in the area did. St. Margaret's Chapel sat tucked into the edge of town, its steeple just visible beyond the hedges that bordered the old cemetery next to it. It was the same chapel Elise once mentioned during an overnight vitals check nearly 2 years ago. "That's where I'd get married," she'd said softly, laughing, about the stained glass windows and the ivy on the brick. At the time, it had sounded like a small, harmless dream. Maya had parked a few blocks away. She didn't plan to go in. She wasn't here to confront anyone or make a scene, but something had stirred in her the moment she saw Elise's fingers clench at the mention of Daniel's name. Something clearer still when Elise looked at the calendar and refused to look away. And when her heart rate jumped in rhythm to songs he once shared with her that had been the final push. So she drove. She walked the last half-mile down a tree-lined road, the sound of her shoes lost beneath birdsong and distant music. The chapel grounds were already full. Guests in pastel suits and long summer dresses milled about near the entrance, where floral arrangements in ivory and blush lined the stone steps. Laughter drifted on the breeze. An usher in a slate-gray vest directed. People inside Maya stood behind the hedges from there. She could see the open side doors of the chapel and the back of Daniel's head. He was adjusting his cuffs and talking to someone, maybe a groomsman, maybe the officiant. He looked calm, relaxed, the kind of man preparing to begin a new chapter. He had no idea that across town, the woman he had once sworn to never. Leave had opened her eyes and lifted her hand when his name was spoken. That she had seen the calendar and understood the date. That her parents had received the wedding announcement the same morning. That a nurse had sat beside her and watched her try to speak. Maya didn't expect guilt to suddenly stop the ceremony. She didn't believe in movie endings or dramatic turnarounds. She wasn't here to be seen. She just needed to witness the moment, to see for herself the division between who Daniel had become and who Elise still was. The music changed. A quartet began to play from somewhere near the altar. Guests were ushered to their seats. Someone called for silence. A few children rustled in the crowd. Then, through the side path, Brielle appeared, her dress shimmering faintly in the golden light. Maya stayed still. Her hands remained in her jacket pockets. When Daniel turned toward the aisle, his smile was subtle, not wide, just a quiet, composed calm. His eyes didn't search the crowd. He wasn't looking for anyone. Maya watched it all at the beginning. A vow spoken without knowledge, a ceremony performed without a missing name ever being said aloud. She turned and walked. Away before the kiss, the drive back was quiet. Her break was nearly over. When she re-entered the hospital, she passed the nurse's desk without stopping. She sanitized her hands, tucked her badge back into place, and returned to room 6. Elise was still awake. Maya stepped to her side, down, and took her hand gently. She didn't speak of what she'd seen, but Elise blinked once, slow and steady, and Maya knew she didn't have to. The room was quiet, except for the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the soft mechanical rhythm of the heart monitor. Afternoon light spilled in through the window, casting a muted glow on the tiles. Elise's mother had stepped out for coffee. No footsteps, no voices, just Elise. She lay still for several minutes, blinking slowly, eyes fixed on a point near the ceiling. Then, without warning, her fingers shifted beneath the blanket. The same hand that had clutched the sheet days before now gripped the fabric at her side. She moved it again, then her other hand joined. She planted both palms against the mattress and pushed. The effort was shaky, uneven. Her arms trembled beneath. The strain, but slowly, inch by inch, she lifted her upper body from the bed. Not far, just enough to tilt forward. The hospital gown clung to her back. Her head sagged with the weight of it all, hair falling over her eyes. She rested there, hunched, as her breathing came faster. Just her decision. She swung her right leg toward the edge of the bed. Her bare feet hovered above the floor, then touched cold tile. The contact was electric, sharp, real. She paused the monitor. Her body leaned heavily forward, still supported mostly by her elbows, but her legs were down. She was sitting. It was the first time she had done that in nearly a year. She closed her eyes, then, gripping the bed frame tightly with one hand, she shifted forward, her heels pressed against the floor, her knees bent. She inched herself closer to the edge until the edge of the mattress no longer held her, and she stood only for a second. Her knees buckled, her legs crumpled beneath her, and her body collapsed forward. Her shoulder struck the nightstand on the way down, sending a plastic water cup skittering to the floor. Her side hit first, then her hip. She slid, half-twisted, to the ground with a muffled gasp of pain. The fall wasn't loud. It was awkward, clumsy, but not enough to trigger the motion sensors. Curled and winded, forehead pressed against the cool tile. Her hand twitched again, reaching for something anything but found only air. Then she moved. Again, first her elbow, then her forearm. Her leg bent awkwardly. She tried to push with it, trembling hard. With one arm braced against the metal frame of the bed, the other gripping the leg of the nightstand, and she breathed in, then out. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter than that. A refusal, maybe. A refusal to remain still. To let the story end with her lying flat, fading while someone else rewrote her place in the world. By the time the nurse returned, Elise was slumped, hair clinging to her face. The nurse rushed to help, calling for assistance, shouting for Maya. But Elise didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had stood, she had fallen, and she had tried again. The city was already shifting into its evening rhythm streetlights, blinking on in quiet order, storefronts dimming one by one. A breeze tugged gently at early autumn leaves, sending them skittering along the sidewalk. At the hospital's rear entrance, Elise stood barely steady in a borrowed coat, her body thinner than it had been a year ago, legs trembling beneath the fabric of loose gray sweatpants. Her hair had been hastily tied back, her shoes mismatched, but her eyes were wide open, awake, determined. The nurse at the front desk hadn't seen her leave. Maya was still in a meeting with the lead physician about updating Elise's recovery plan. No one had expected movement this soon. No one knew she could get out on her own again, but she had, and she was standing now at the curb, alone, holding a crumpled piece of white paper between her fingers, a single origami crane. It had been resting on the tray beside her bed that morning, folded by Lily, the same way she always left. Then Elise had slipped it into her coat pocket before slipping out. She looked down the road. Cars passed indifferent. Her legs were weak, barely holding her upright. But she lifted her arm anyway, stretching it toward the street like she remembered doing before back when she was someone else, someone whole. The first few cars didn't stop, then one did. A dented maroon taxi pulled up to the curb, its paint sun-faded, one hubcap missing. The driver leaned across the passenger seat and rolled the window down halfway. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with silver streaks in his beard and warm eyes. "You all right, miss?" he asked, voice cautious but kind. Elise opened her mouth, but no words came. Her throat worked, her lips moved. Still silence. She held up the crane. The driver looked at it, confused at first, then his expression changed. He stared at her face. Recognition flickered there, slow but certain. "I've seen you," he murmured, "in the paper." "You were in the accident." Elise nodded once, weakly. He unlocked the door without asking for more. She eased into the back seat, every movement stiff and painful. The interior smelled faintly of pine and old leather. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the crane tighter in her lap. She didn't know what to say, couldn't say anything even if she tried. The driver adjusted his mirror and met her eyes again. "Where to?" She reached into her pocket, pulled out a worn piece of stationery, the chapel's address. Scribbled by her mother months ago during one of those hopeful mornings when they'd talk to Elise, as if she could hear. Elise had memorized it by the curve of each letter. She handed it to him. He looked at it, then looked at her again. "You sure?" Her eyes didn't waver. He nodded, put the car into drive. They pulled away from the curb. Elise leaned her forehead against the cool glass window, watching as the buildings blurred past pharmacies, cafes, houses with quiet porches. She felt her limbs aching, her body unsure, but she stayed upright, hands still wrapped around the paper crane in her lap. The driver said nothing for a while, halfway through the ride. He spoke again, "You don't need to worry about fare," he said, not looking back. "Not tonight." Elise didn't react at first. Then, after a pause, she lifted the crane and slowly extended it forward, placing it gently on the center console between them. The driver looked down at it, then smiled, not out of amusement, but understanding. Something about the fragility of it, the care in its folds. He didn't ask her why she was going there, didn't ask who was waiting, he just drove. The city grew quieter as they neared the chapel, and in the back seat, Elise closed her eyes, gathering herself, one hand on the door handle, the other still holding the place where the crane had been. The bell above St. Margaret's Chapel rang out its soft, measured tones once, twice, then again, each chime folded into the autumn air, stirring leaves along the church's garden path. Guests were already filing into the main hall, their voices hushed with polite excitement, their shoes clicking over polished stone. Ushers in tailored suits guided people to pews lined with white ribbon and rose petals. A quartet in the gallery tuned their instruments. The organist placed her fingers over the keys. Inside, the sanctuary glowed with late afternoon light pouring through the stained glass windows Elise once admired. The painted glass threw colored patterns across the pews and aisle-like fragments of something sacred. Everything looked exactly as Elise had imagined it. Once, but no one was looking back down the garden path, Elise stood beyond the iron gate, one hand steadying herself against the vine-wrapped post. The taxi was long gone, the driver having watched her take the first few steps before pulling away without a word. Her legs ached with every movement. Her lungs felt too small. The coat she wore no longer kept out the chill, but she kept walking. Her shoes touched the stone walkway leading to the chapel doors. It was uneven in parts, narrow in others, but familiar. She took each step as if remembering where to place her weight, not just on the ground, but in the moment her hands were bare. No bouquet, no veil, just a hospital band, still looped around one wrist and bruises faint beneath her sleeves. Inside, Daniel stood at the altar. He didn't know she was coming. He adjusted his cufflinks again, his fingers twitching with a nervous energy that hadn't left him since he woke up. Betrayal stood in the vestibule just beyond the inner doors, hidden from his view, her dress cascading behind her. She smiled at the pastor's gentle nod and waited for the cue. A hush settled over the crowd. The music began. Elise could hear it as she neared the front steps. Strings, soft and practiced, filling the space just as the chapel doors opened inward. She reached the base of the stairs and paused. No one turned around from where she stood. She could see flickers of movement through the glass pane shoulders, straightening, heads tilting, hands folding in laps. But no one noticed her silhouette beyond the archway. Her fingers brushed the handle, pulled metal. She didn't open it. Instead, she followed the narrow path that led alongside the chapel through the hedges. Past the old stone bench she once rested on with Daniel after a summer afternoon hike, her feet dragged slightly now, the incline just enough to strain her legs. She pressed her palm to the outer wall for balance. Inside, the organ rose louder. Betrayal stepped through the doorway and began her walk down the aisle. Daniel turned to see her. Guests rose. All at once, the moment had arrived, and just beyond the far side window, Elise reached the corner of the chapel. She didn't rush. Her breath came sharp in the cool air. Her heart pushed painfully against her ribs. She could hear the vows beginning, muffled behind the thick stone wall. She found the side entrance, the one no one used anymore, the old wooden door with peeling paint, mostly forgotten. She didn't touch it. She stood outside, her hand pressed to the wall, eyes closed, listening, not to stop anything, not to undo it, just to be present, to exist in the same moment someone else tried to erase. The music played on, inside. The ceremony continued. Outside, Elise stood alone beneath the falling leaves, the final paper crane still folded in her coat pocket. The chapel had never been quieter, not even during the organ's pauses or the prayerful moments before vows. The silence now was different, held, stretched, made tight with ceremony and expectation. The stained glass windows poured color onto the aisle like a slow-moving river. At the front, Daniel stood with his hands folded just beneath his waist, his shoulders squared but tense. Betrayal beside him, her eyes steady, one hand tucked lightly into his dot. The officiant cleared his throat gently, the way a man does before reaching a familiar line. His voice had been warm and rehearsed until now. But as he looked out over the gathered guests, he let the weight of the next sentence land with full clarity. If there is anyone here who knows a reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now. There was a breath, then another, a moment long enough for a laugh, or a cough, or a glance exchanged between cousins. But no one moved until someone did. From the far back of the church, just past the last pew, between the shadowed vestibule and the open doorway, stood a woman. She wasn't dressed for a wedding. Her coat hung awkwardly, 2 sizes too large, sleeves pushed up to reveal a hospital band still clinging to her wrist. Her hair had not been styled, only tied back in a loose, uneven knot. Her face was pale, eyes wide, her entire body trembled. But she was visible. One guest turned Dot, then another. A wave of slow realization moved up the pews like a current. Faces tilted, hands rose halfway to mouths. The quartet faltered. A cello string went silent. The organist looked up Dot. Daniel turned to Dot. His head moved slowly, like he wasn't expecting to see anything. Not really, just routine reflex. But when his gaze landed on the woman in the back, when his eyes actually saw her, he stopped breathing. He blinked once, then again there was no mistaking her. She hadn't changed in a way that made her unfamiliar. She had changed in the way a person does when they've gone somewhere others can't follow and come back. Her body thinner, her posture slightly sunken, but it was her. It was Elise. She didn't speak. She couldn't yet, not with her voice. But her presence alone had spoken more than words. Gasps rippled quietly across the chapel. Guests leaned sideways, trying to see better. One of Daniel's cousins whispered something inaudible. A bridesmaid clutched her bouquet tighter. The officiant remained frozen and brailed her head still. Turned forward, had not yet seen. Daniel's lips parted slightly. No words came, not even her name. Elise didn't take a step forward. She didn't raise her hand or shake her head. She just stood there, clutching the edge of the doorway with both hands, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She had made it not to stop the wedding, not to accuse, but to be seen. To remind all of them that she existed, that she was never gone in the way they believed, that she had waited, woken, walked, Dot, and now. Here she stood, at the very moment where the past meets the present. The officiant looked to Daniel. Uncertain whether to continue, Daniel couldn't speak either. Elise's eyes didn't leave his, and in them he saw everything. The hospital bed, the absence, the silence, the paper cranes. There was no scene, no screaming, just a woman, awake, trembling in the back of the church, and the question still hanging in the air, waiting to be answered. Time didn't break. It slowed. Daniel's fingers slipped from Briel's hand before he realized he'd let go. The air in the chapel thickened, the warmth of candlelight now feeling too close. His eyes stayed fixed on the woman in the back, motionless, pale, framed by the soft light from the open doors behind her. Elise didn't move, and she didn't need to. Just the fact of her standing there was enough. He saw her, not like a memory, not like a haunting thought from nights alone. He saw her as she was. And for the first time since the accident, the version of her standing in front of him wasn't the broken image he had buried in the quietest part of his mind. She wasn't just the hospital bed, the chart updates, the occasional dream he dismissed in the morning. She was real, awake, and she had come here. Alone, Briel's face turned toward him slowly, confusion tightening her brow. Her voice didn't come. She just followed the line of his gaze. Then she saw Elise too. Her lips parted, but the words didn't leave. Around them, the pews had stilled completely. Even the fidgeting children stopped. The silence in the chapel had gone beyond reverent. It was breathless. A few guests shifted their eyes back and forth between Daniel and the figure near the doorway, unsure whether they were witnessing the beginning of something or the collapse of something else. Daniel's chest rose. He took a half step forward before catching himself. He hadn't spoken her name in months, hadn't dared to. It had become a quiet shame, a folded-away regret dressed up as acceptance. He told himself he had mourned. He told himself he had waited long enough. He told himself love needed to live forward. But now, with her standing there, all of that collapsed into something smaller, something dishonest. His mouth opened again, still nothing. Elise's eyes never blinked. Her fingers gripped the doorframe for balance, but her face was calm, pale but calm. Her entire body shivered, not from cold, but from the unbearable pressure of the moment. Pressing in from every direction, Brielle took a small step back, not out of fear, just distance. She looked at Daniel, then back at Elise, and it was all in her face now, the dawning of a truth she had not been prepared for. Not because he'd lied, but because he hadn't dared imagine this was still possible. And maybe deep down, Brielle saw what everyone else now saw. Daniel wasn't looking at her. The officiant cleared his throat once, hesitant, as if remembering. He still held a book in his hands, still stood at the altar, but he didn't speak. No one did. Daniel took a breath and stepped out from under the arch. A single motion, deliberate, heavy, and still he didn't look away from Elise. For just a flicker of time, everything they had been returned to the space between them. Not spoken, just shared. That bookstore in winter, the ring still in the drawer, the hospital room he hadn't entered for months. And now this, he raised his hand slightly, as if he might say her name or reach for her. Elise flinched. The sound of her heel scraping backward echoed faintly against the stone floor. Not a retreat, not quite, just instinct. The motion of someone unsure whether they belonged here or had ever been welcome at all. That was when Maya appeared. She had run from the parking lot, coat trailing behind her, having learned just moments before that Elise had left on her own. Her breath caught in her throat as she spotted the scene frozen in front of her, Daniel halfway down the aisle, Brielle still by the altar, and Elise alone at the entrance, barely standing. Maya reached Elise's side and gently placed a hand on her arm. Elise didn't resist. Her weight leaned ever so slightly toward the nurse, knees giving under her dot, and still Daniel didn't move again. He just stood there, facing the woman he once promised never to leave, and this time he couldn't look away. A soft scrape of a shoe against the floor, the subtle creak of a wooden pew, a hand lowered from a bouquet, a shoulder turned slightly to another, but none of them rose above a breath. The room hadn't erupted. First, she had kept her gaze on Daniel, watching the strange, arrested expression on his face, something weighty. And then, like a reflex delayed by disbelief, she followed his line of sight and saw her. Elise stood framed by the doorway, half in light, half in shadow. Her shoulders hunched forward ever so slightly, as if the force of what she was witnessing pressed her inward. Her eyes were wide. She didn't speak. Her lips parted once, then closed again. One hand clutched the wooden frame. The other trembled loosely at her side. Brielle didn't speak either. Her mind was still trying to explain away what she saw. Her heart knew the truth the second it registered Daniel's silence. She turned back toward him. His face was ashen. His eyes hadn't left the woman in the doorway. Neither had anyone else's. A bridesmaid leaned toward another. An older guest in the second row clutched his program tightly. Pale, the moment had collapsed into itself. Not chaos, just a stillness too loud to ignore. The officiant stood uncertain. One hand still holding the open book, the other falling slightly to his side. This had never happened before. Not in this church, not in this city, not to people like them. Daniel shifted his weight forward, one foot stepping gently down from the altar. His eyes remained locked on Elise, who hadn't moved since she'd first appeared. There was no demand in her face, no accusation, no plea, just presence, just the undeniable reality of her being here. Awake witnessing. Maya stood behind her now, one hand still hovering near Elise's back, ready to steady her if she collapsed. Her eyes scanned the pews nervously, then returned to Daniel. Elise blinked. Brielle's voice finally broke the silence, just loud enough for Daniel to hear, but not the rest of the room. Who is she? It wasn't angry, it wasn't suspicious. It was the kind of question that didn't need an answer, because the answer was already in the room, in the way Daniel looked, in the way his shoulders had slumped forward, in the way his hand had fallen from hers without resistance. Still, he said it, Elise. The name slipped out of his mouth like something he hadn't said in years, as though it had been waiting inside him, beneath layers of new routines and carefully managed memory. The name alone cracked the ceremony open. Brielle turned fully now. Facing Elise, their eyes met. Two women, one in a hospital coat, one in a bridal gown. Two timelines suddenly forced to overlap. Elise didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She didn't take a step forward or back. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that might collapse under any weight at all. Maya leaned in slightly, whispering something into Elise's ear. Elise nodded. It was a small movement, but enough to say she was still standing. Deciding dot, and the chapel, still full of people. Felt like a held breath waiting for something, anything, to move next. But Elise wasn't here to deliver a scene. She wasn't here to yell or accuse or demand. She was here to exist, to make visible what had been buried dot, and sometimes that's louder than anything said out loud. Brielle took one breath, then another. Her heels shifted slightly against the smooth floor of the chapel, the faint tap of movement breaking the silence that had thickened around them. For a moment, she looked down, as if searching the hem of her dress for steadiness, then slowly she stepped down from the altar. The room stayed still, all eyes followed her. Unsure of what she was about to do, her bouquet remained clutched in one hand, pressed to her side now, no longer part of a performance. Her movements were quiet, deliberate. She didn't look at the guests, not at Daniel, not at the officiant, still holding a book with trembling fingers. She walked straight toward the back toward Elise. Each step landed like a question. Elise hadn't moved. She stood under the high arch of the vestibule, her face pale but composed. The only sound near her was the quiet hum of her breath, and the occasional rustle of Maya adjusting her stance to steady her. Elise's hand still held the wooden frame of the door, as if letting go would cause the moment to vanish or worse, break open. Brielle stopped about 10 feet away from her. They stood like that bride and not quite bride, ceremony and interruption, future and memory facing each other without a single word. Elise's mouth didn't open. Her voice hadn't returned, but it didn't matter. Her presence carried more weight than 1,000 spoken objections. She didn't point, she didn't cry, she didn't reach out. But her body held everything she couldn't say. The days lost, the photos removed, the promises made and quietly abandoned. Her silence echoed all of it. Brielle's eyes searched Elise's face, her brow tightening slightly. There was no anger in it, just realization, a kind of private grief, not over betrayal, but over being part of a story she never knew had chapters left unfinished. Behind them, the congregation had gone from stunned to breathless. Daniel hadn't moved. He stood frozen halfway between the altar and the back pews, watching the two women in front of him. His hands were at his sides now, fingers slack. There was no urgency in him, no defense forming on his lips, because there was nothing to defend. The space she had stood in just moments before. Then she turned forward again and took one final step. She held out the bouquet. Elise didn't take it. Not from pride, not from refusal, but because her hands weren't ready to carry anything yet, not symbols, not expectations. So Brielle lowered it gently onto the small table beside the chapel wall, the one where candles had been lit earlier for blessings and absent loved ones. The bouquet rested there now, quiet and out of place. Elise blinked slowly, gave the smallest nod. Then, still without speaking, she turned and walked down the side aisle, her train trailing behind her, not dramatic, not angry, just the end of something being acknowledged in full. No one followed her. No one followed her. No one called out. She disappeared behind the side curtain that led to the bridal preparation room. A door clicked, faintly shut, and still Elise stood. She had not claimed a place. She had not asked for anything. But the moment was hers now, because she demanded it, but because she endured to reach it. The guests began to stir again. Some looked at Daniel, some looked at Elise, some lowered their eyes entirely, unsure where to land. Maya stepped beside Elise more fully now, her hand more firm at her back. Elise remained upright, her chin barely lifted, and for the first time since waking, she was no longer alone in the room. The side room was smaller than it looked from the chapel. Once used for wedding preparations and quiet prayers, it now felt like a vault of unanswered questions. The light filtering in through the narrow window painted soft lines across the floor. A mirror hung on the far wall, still dusted with the breath of hairspray and rushed touch-ups. It reflected a scene no one had planned for. Maya led Elise in first, helping her lower herself slowly into the nearest chair. Her body was tired, legs trembling from the walk, but she didn't complain. Her fingers gripped the edge of the armrest. as if bracing for something even heavier than exhaustion. Daniel entered moments later. The door didn't slam. It clicked closed with a weight more final than forceful. He didn't speak immediately, just stood there, just past the threshold, as if unsure whether he was supposed to be in this room at all. Maya stood to the side, watching him. Elise's eyes lifted. It was the first time they'd been alone, truly alone, since the accident. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. He began, but stopped. His hands came together in front of him, fingers laced. He looked down at the floor, then up at her again. Elise's voice, when it came, was not loud. It scraped against the quiet with the fragile weight of someone still relearning how to speak. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't apologize. She asked one question. "How long was I asleep?" Daniel exhaled slowly, as though the question knocked something loose in him. 14. Monsi said. Elise didn't react visibly. No flinch, no gasp. Just a steady breath that carried more than surprise. It carried confirmation. Some part of her had known, or feared, or felt every passing day in some buried place she couldn't reach until now. Daniel took a step closer. "I didn't know what to do," he added softly. "I came every day at first, but then the doctor said that I wouldn't wake up." Elise finished for him. Her voice was stronger now, though it cracked at the edges. She didn't look away. "They said you might never," he said, "but you still could have told me goodbye before replacing me." Daniel's shoulders dropped. His mouth opened again, as if to explain, to untangle all the hours and decisions that had led to this moment. But no explanation came. Elise sat still. She looked around the room at the mirror, the flowers left behind. The dress bag slumped against a chair in the corner, evidence of a day meant for someone else. She looked back at him. "Did you think I'd never know?" she asked. He hesitated. "I thought, if you never woke up, then maybe it would be okay to move on. And if I did," Daniel's silence was answer enough. Maya moved quietly toward the door. She didn't speak, didn't offer comfort, just left them with the privacy they needed. The door clicked softly behind her. Elise leaned forward, hands resting in her lap now. She wasn't crying, her face was dry, but her eyes burned. "You loved me," she said. "You promised I did," he said. "I thought I lost you. You let me go before I was gone?" He said nothing. Elise nodded once. Not in forgiveness, not yet, but in acknowledgement of the truth that hung between them now, exposed and heavy. Then she leaned back in the chair again, as though the weight of knowing was somehow heavier than the coma she'd left behind. The room was quiet again, but not empty. The stillness wasn't peace, it was recollection. Elise sat there, back straight now, eyes not fixed on Daniel anymore, but on a space slightly past him, a place somewhere between memory and now. She remembered everything, not in fragments, not in flashes, but in sequence, as if someone had pressed play on a reel that had waited, patient, at the edge of her mind. It started with laughter hers, and Daniel's echoing softly through the narrow aisles of that little bookstore near the river. It had rained that day too. They had ducked inside to wait it out. He'd pulled a copy of a poetry book from the shelf, teasing her with a mock reading of love sonnets. She had rolled her eyes, but she'd smiled. He had taken her hand then, kissed her wrist, and said without hesitation, "I'll never leave you, Elise, no matter what." She had believed him. The image shifted, her fingers grazing the fabric of her favorite sweater, the one he'd draped over her shoulders when they sat near the pier later that night. The smell of coffee on his breath. The way his thumb always circled her knuckle when he held her hand, absent-minded and soft. The accident hadn't stolen those moments. It had buried them, but now they resurfaced with startling clarity. Not as pain, but as evidence. She had lived those days, felt them. She wasn't imagining the life they had begun to build. Then the later memories came. Daniel standing by her bedside, the smell of antiseptic and late-shift exhaustion on him, his voice lower, uncertain. At first, he read to her. Sometimes he played music. He brought the same poetry book once, placed it on the side table, and said her name aloud 3 times before leaving, and then less, fewer visits. Shorter ones. She remembered the way the nurses' voices had changed when they spoke of him, softer, hesitant. One said he'd been promoted at work. Another mentioned seeing him with a woman in the cafeteria. Then the silence, the phone calls. She could almost hear. The voicemail alert she couldn't answer. His voice never came again, not even in her half-formed dreams. She remembered her mother's tears by the window, her father's hand gripping the side rail of her bed, knuckles white. The photo of her and Daniel that had once sat beside the monitor gone, no one mentioned why. The worst part was not being forgotten. It was being erased slowly in quiet decisions. The memory of the ring was the clearest now. She had worn it every day. Simple, gold with a tiny sapphire. She used to trace the edge of the stone with her thumb when she was nervous. In the hospital, it was gone. Nurses had stored her jewelry in a labeled pouch, they said, but she never saw it again. She looked at Daniel now. He was still standing, still quiet, watching her remember. She didn't ask him why. There were no more questions, only confirmations. And in her silence, the weight of everything unspoken filled the space. Her body had slept, but her mind had held on. Through soundless days and forgotten nights, it had gripped the threads of what was real, the bookstore, the promise, the ring, and the moment she knew he had already begun to leave her long before she opened her eyes. Elise sat forward slowly, her movements deliberate but no longer uncertain. The chair beneath her creaked softly as she reached into the side pocket of the hospital-issued coat, still draped loosely over her shoulders. Her fingers moved with a quiet determination. The envelope had been folded and refolded, worn at the edges but still sealed. The paper held a faint bend from time spent tucked beneath her mattress in ICU room 6. Daniel watched her hands, not yet realizing what she was about to give him. She extended it toward him without a word. He took it, carefully, like it might tear if touched too hard. His thumb brushed the top corner, where her handwriting curved in small, steady strokes. It was addressed simply. Daniel, if anything happens, no date, no return address. Just her name on the back, written faintly in blue ink. He stared at it. Wrote it the week before, Elise said. Her voice was steadier now, quiet but whole. I didn't plan on the accident, but I had this feeling, one of those things you don't talk about because it sounds foolish. But it stayed with me. So I wrote it. Daniel looked up, unsure. You were going to propose? She added. I knew, not from anything you said, but you started hiding things in drawers. You bought new shoes. You were nervous when we talked about the future. She paused, not to wait for confirmation, but to gather the edge of a memory still sharp. I thought, maybe, just in case something ever happened, I should leave you something honest. I wanted you to have something that didn't come from doctors or reports or silence. Daniel turned the envelope over once more. Should I read it now? He asked, voice low. You can or not. It's yours now. He opened it. The flap tore with a soft, dry sound. Inside, a single page folded in thirds. The creases were faint from age, but still held their shape. Daniel unfolded it slowly. His eyes began scanning the words, line by line, and Elise watched him not for his reaction, but for the space between them, where the past was about to meet the present. The letter was written in blue ink, her handwriting familiar and measured. There were no dramatic declarations, no poetic turns, just her voice, exactly as he had once known it, clear, careful, hopeful. She had written about the little things, how she loved waking up to the sound of him making coffee, the way he hummed without knowing it. She wrote about their plans to adopt a dog after his promotion. About the bookstore they kept saying they'd visit again when it wasn't raining. About how she didn't care what the ring looked like, just that it came from him. And then the last paragraph she wrote, if anything ever happens to me, I want you to know I never doubted us. Even if I couldn't speak, even if I couldn't move, I'd still know you were mine, and I'd still be yours. I trust you. That's what love is. Daniel's eyes stopped there. He didn't finish the letter aloud. His hand lowered, resting on his lap, the page still open. His mouth parted, as if trying to say something. But there was nothing that would fit. Elise didn't cry. She didn't take the letter back. She just sat there. Across from him, her silence no longer a symptom, but a choice. Letting the words she'd written before everything unraveled settle into the room like dust finding its way to a windowsill. Some truths didn't need repeating. They only needed to be seen. Daniel folded the letter slowly, careful not to crease it further. He placed it back into the envelope, sealing it again, even though the flap no longer stuck. His hands rested in his lap, holding it like something fragile, like a thing he no longer had the right to possess. Across from him, Elise remained still. Her posture was upright, calm, but her eyes no longer drifted. They were fixed now, fully present, seeing him without flinching. He cleared his throat once. The silence after the letter had stretched longer than either of them expected. It wasn't awkward. It was necessary. I didn't know what to say. To you after the first few months, Daniel said quietly. At first, I told myself you'd wake up any day. I sat there, waiting. But every week, the doctors grew less hopeful. Your parents were there more than I was. They started asking questions I didn't know how to answer. Elise didn't respond. Her face didn't shift. Her hands were clasped together gently, one thumb moving in slow circles over the other. Daniel, went on, I kept coming anyway, even when they said nothing had changed. But eventually I started thinking maybe they were right. Maybe you weren't coming back. And every time I left the hospital, it felt like a failure. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't bring you back. And being around your family, I started to feel like a ghost myself. Still, Elise didn't interrupt. She was listening. Every word, every pause. But her silence didn't encourage him, it measured him. I never meant to stop visiting, Daniel continued. It just happened slowly. I told myself I was giving you space. I told myself I was coping, but I stopped returning calls from your mom. I couldn't bring myself to walk into the room anymore. And then I met Brielle. I didn't plan that either. Elise nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding that these were the words he had been holding, that these were the explanations he needed to give. I loved you, he said, more firmly now. Part of me still does. I thought I lost you, and I didn't know how to carry that kind of grief. The room was quiet again. Then Elise spoke. You left, she said plainly. Her voice didn't shake. That's the only part I remember. Daniel looked up. I know. No, I don't think you do, she said. You left not when the accident happened, not when the doctors said I might not wake up. You left when it got hard, when I couldn't ask you to stay. He blinked slowly. His mouth opened, then closed again. You were the only voice I was waiting to hear, Elise continued. I didn't need hope or reports. I needed you to remind me who I was, that I still existed outside that bed, but you disappeared. And then someone else filled that silence. Not with words, with nothing, just absence. And it felt louder than anything. Daniel's jaw tensed. I'm sorry, he said. I know, but this time she didn't say it kindly. She said it like someone who had waited too long for an apology, and now didn't need it. Not all love survives silence, Elise added. He nodded slowly, as if the words were landing in real time. I didn't know how to be there for you. And now you do, she said. But I'm not the same girl from the bookstore. Daniel didn't argue. He looked down at the envelope once more. Then, he placed it gently on the nearby table, not trying to take it with him. It no longer belonged to him. Elise turned her face toward the window. The afternoon light had begun to change. Softer, thinner. Nothing about her posture invited closure. But it didn't invite more either. Some endings don't need declarations. They just need the silence to be understood. Elise walked out of the side room with no one beside her. The hush of the hallway pressed in around her like the closing of a curtain. Guests at the wedding were beginning to murmur again. Some turned when she passed, uncertain whether they should recognize her, speak, or pretend she wasn't there. But Elise didn't meet their eyes. Her steps were slow, not from weakness now, but from intention. She hadn't come to interrupt anything. She hadn't stormed the ceremony or raised her voice. She hadn't demanded answers or created a scene. The disruption had been his long before she ever opened her eyes. All she had done was stand and be seen. Outside, the breeze had softened. The sun hovered in that brief moment before descent, warm but no longer blinding. The church garden still smelled of peonies and trimmed grass. Somewhere behind her, someone was likely explaining the delay to the guests. A wedding coordinator, trying to salvage the moment. A best man improvising with a toast. Brielle, maybe, sitting in a back room now, not saying anything at all. But Elise didn't think of Brielle. She didn't think of whether the vows would be completed or whether Daniel would follow her again. That wasn't the point. She had come for one reason: not to stop a marriage, not to expose betrayal, not even to ask for closure. She had come to show him that she lived, that the woman he had once promised never to leave had survived every moment he thought she wouldn't. She had woken up alone. She had learned how to walk again alone. She had remembered who she was, alone, and she had found her voice, without needing his name at the center of it. When the taxi dropped her at the church, she hadn't known what would happen, whether she would collapse at the gate, whether she'd make it inside, whether Daniel would even see her. But she hadn't come for a scene. She hadn't come for revenge. She came because there are moments in life when silence becomes unbearable, when absence writes too much of someone else's story, and Elise had decided she would not be written out of her own life without standing in it at least once. Fully awake, she made her way down the gravel path behind the church, toward the edge of the garden. A wooden bench sat tucked beneath a wide sycamore. She lowered herself onto it slowly. Her muscles ached. Her breath felt shallow. But the weight she carried was lighter now from her coat pocket. She took the final paper crane. It was the only one she had kept from her niece's visits, pale blue, slightly flattened at the wings, a quiet companion in weeks of recovery. She rested it on the bench beside her, smoothing its fold. She didn't cry. There was no dramatic swell of emotion, no collapse, just stillness. A peace that wasn't perfect but was hers. Inside the church, bells began to ring. Not wedding bells, not yet, just the hour. Elise looked up at the sound, expression unreadable. Then she stood, alone, again, but not invisible. The path was uneven, small stones catching beneath Elise's shoes, but she didn't falter. Her steps were measured, not rushed, not hesitant. Behind her, the church remained visible, tall and white against the muted sky, but she no longer looked back. The murmurs from inside, the music that had once swelled for someone else's beginning, were distant now. Elise's pace didn't change. She walked as if the silence was a companion she had chosen. There had been no dramatic exit, no confrontation in front of guests, no doors thrown open. Just her, walking down the path, passing between rows of garden roses and iron lampposts. Her figure, a quiet punctuation at the end of a sentence, no longer hers to finish. Her hands were empty. No bouquet, no ring. Just the soft rustle of hospital fabric still worn under her coat and the cool breath of evening pressing gently against her skin. She hadn't spoken to anyone else after Daniel. No last words, no explanations. There was nothing more she needed. To prove, nothing more to ask. She had not come to win, to reclaim, or to accuse. She had come to exist, to remind someone, and maybe herself, that she had not vanished. That breath and voice and memory had survived beneath the layers of stillness that others mistook for absence. The coma had quieted her body, but not her. Inside that room, my CU room 6 time, had continued, slow and methodical, pressing against her in waves. Every sound, every voice that came and went, left traces, and she had held them, stored them, until one day the silence cracked and light came through. Not as thunder, as a whisper she recognized, the sound of paper being folded. The music nurse. Maya left playing a little too long, the name spoken without care, but still enough to reach her. She hadn't been gone. She had only been waiting. Now she walked not as a symbol of tragedy or survival, but as a woman reclaiming what had never truly left her. Herself, not the one Daniel remembered, not the one the world had paused for, but the one who had rebuilt. From the silence, the trees swayed above her as she passed through the outer gates. A soft breeze brushed her face. Somewhere behind the tall hedges, the ceremony was likely resuming, rearranged and awkward. Someone was probably explaining Elise's presence as a misunderstanding or a medical anomaly. Maybe Daniel was still inside, maybe he wasn't. It didn't matter. That chapter had closed the moment she chose to walk forward rather than stay and listen. At the edge of the street, she stopped. The sidewalk stretched out in both directions. No one waited for her. No ride had been arranged. She hadn't thought that far ahead, not in concrete steps. But there was no panic in her stillness. She knew how to wait, and she knew how to move. She sat for a moment on a nearby bench. The final crane, folded carefully by her niece, was still in her coat pocket. She pulled it out and turned it slowly in her hands. She didn't open it, didn't need to, whatever. Message it carried had already done its work. When she rose again, the sun had slipped lower. Her shadow stretched long behind her. She crossed the street slowly, calmly, head high, spine steady. Each step pressed her further away from the version of her that had once belonged to someone else's story. The church bells did not ring again, no. Applause followed. But Elise walked on without an audience. The coma had silenced her body, but not her will, not her clarity, not her memory, and now no one else would define her silence again.